Welcome. It's Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights, here with Bill Sutherland, longtime friend and very important person at Beckett Media and very important person at Beckett Publications as well. But first, thanks sponsors, Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication, ComC.com, Burbank Sports Cards, Mike's Stadium Sports Cards, Heritage Auctions, Huggins & Scott Auctions, Tops, Panini, and Upper Deck.
Thanks, Jim. I really appreciate you, having me on. I've looked forward to this for quite some time since you first brought this idea to us, and we've all enjoyed the existing episodes. And I've learned, quite a bit about people that I've known for 30 years and said, wow, never heard that story before. So
yeah.
Definitely some interesting, tidbits coming out. I've been in the hobby now. This is my 36th year, actually, in terms of collecting in some form or fashion. At 10 years old, I was a big Chicago Blackhawks fan. My dad and I went to games, and I thought it would be cool to get some hockey cards. So I was at a flea market in Indiana called Uncle John's Flea Market, and my good buddy Dave Slipka will know all about that place. It's got a bunch of barns full of junk. And I was walking through, and there was like a 1970-71 Topps binder of cards, and I bought my first card for $1, Pitt Martin. And I put it in my wallet, my Velcro wallet as a 10-year-old, and I carried that card around for probably a good 6 to 8 years. And once I realized the extent of the hobby at that point as a 10-year-old, I said, this is pretty cool. And hockey cards were cheap. And this is 1984, so the big blitz on hockey hadn't really started. So my dad and I started collecting, and we reached out to a couple local hobby shops, and Dalton Hobby and Collectibles, old school Ken. He's been around a long time. His shop was in the back of a barber shop. You walk through the barber shop, and then there was his little baseball card store behind that. And I'd go in and ask for hockey cards, and he'd say, yeah, I got some. And he'd give me a box. My first 700 count box I ever went through was 84, 85 Topps hockey. He said, take what you want, nickel a card. So I picked out all the ones that said Space RC on the end of the description based off of probably an old Sport Americana guide. So I was picking up Yzerman rookies, LaFontaine rookies, Barrasso rookies, a nickel, 10 cents a piece. And I stocked up. And at that point, he realized I was a hockey fan. And over the time, probably between the time I was 10 years old and 16 years old, I had a complete run of 68, 69 to the present hockey sets. All complete, Topps and O-Pee-Chee, and that was what really got me rolling. Chicago, obviously, hotbed of the hobby activity for a lot of people. So I started doing shows, and I would do church shows and VFW hall shows and you name it. And I was buying cards for my friends, and I'd have to steal $1 from my mom's wallet every once in a while to buy a card. And I bought a Mario Lemieux rookie from a buddy for $1 and was able to sell it for 10 and thought that was unbelievable. Garage sales, you name it. So I really got hooked on the collecting aspect. And then I got hooked on, hey, I'm 12, 13 years old, and now I can make a couple bucks. I can buy a candy bar. I can buy some more packs of cards. I can run up to the local drugstore in our town, and I could get 86 Topps baseball looking for, Floyd Yeomans at the time and whoever the guys were. So it just grew for me. And I started doing these shows. I did one show, I think I was 12, and I did $1,000 at a church show. And my parents thought I stole from the collection plate or something crazy, because here I am 12 years old and I did $1,000. So they encouraged me. We kept growing. I'd buy collections from the guys in the neighborhood, and I visited a lot of local card shops and bought out their hockey inventory because I said, hey, I'm going to focus. I love hockey. So I did pretty well running around the city, the south side of Chicago. I ran into this guy called Dave Slipka, didn't know his last name, just knew him. We interacted at shows many times in the south suburbs of Chicago, only to come to realize that another 10 years later, we worked together closely at this place called Beckett Publications out in Dallas, Texas. So that was a weird little crossover. But as I grew up, I started doing more and more shows. I got a car. I could drive all over the city into Indiana, into Wisconsin, and I became known as the hockey guy. Just lots and lots of hockey. And we had Michael Jordan, a famous guy in the 90s there. And we did really well on basketball, 1991, 91, 2, 2, 3. Phenomenal for us. So I got a couple jobs in card shops, JC's Cards and Comics, Doc's Comics, KDS Cards and Collectibles, and worked with a lot of different guys in the industry, and eventually bought out some of their businesses and ran some stores up until I went to college. Attended University of Illinois, Chicago. So I'd go to school in the morning, and then I'd come home and I'd play with baseball cards, and I'd sort, and I'd get my little sister sorting cards, and I'd get my mom sorting cards, and do the card stores in the evenings and do shows on the weekends. Eventually, the summer of 1996, I see an ad in Beckett Hockey. Hey, we're looking for analysts. So about May or June, I send in my letter, very amateurish. I'd never done a resume. I'm pretty young at that point in college. And by August or September, I hadn't heard from Beckett. And I'm like, forget this guy. He doesn't want me. It doesn't make a difference now. I'm moving on. So I finished up. I'm still in college. And eventually Dan Hitt calls me and says, hey, we would like to interview you for hockey. And they put on this guy called Al Muir, who absolutely grills me on some crazy hockey minor league stuff I'd never heard of, and teams and you name it. But I did well enough that they flew me out to Dallas, probably September, October of 1996. And I spent an evening with the entire team, and Grant Sandground and Pat Blandford and Mike Jasperson. And these guys grilled me over dinner at Steak and Ale or something, talking hockey. And great time, very nerve-wracking seeing all these guys whose names I'd read in the magazine, and I saw their stories and I saw their readers write questions and things like that. And apparently I had a good interview. I flew back to Chicago that Wednesday, and Dan Hitt made an offer to me by lunchtime that day. So a little negotiation, a little back and forth, and I took the offer. And at the time I was at Purdue University finishing up my degree in criminology, of all things. I was supposed to go into the FBI.
Hold on, Bill. Basically, everything you've said is consistent with everything you've done since then. Okay. But only thing I want to draw out, though, is that when Dan made you an offer, you're the master negotiator. Are you saying you took his offer, or are you?
No, absolutely not. I got an offer and I said, wow, that's interesting. I kind of started doing the math, but I had never lived on my own. I'd never had an apartment. I don't know, anything about Dallas, Texas, other than I don't like the Cowboys. And that was it. So I'm thinking the TV show Dallas and a bunch of guys on horses and boots. And I had no idea. So I did a little research that day and called up a couple other people at Beckett that I had their business cards and said, where do you live? What does it cost to live? And I did some of the math and I said, wow, Dan's leaving me about $100 a month for food. I don't think this is going to work. I'm going to have to bounce back and forth here. I also knew what the jobs in law enforcement were going to pay. Chicago Police Department, I was, on the list to join that. Chicago Fire. So I had an idea. So Dan and I went back and forth, and he was tough, but I think he was in the position where hockey was a tough hire and has always been a tough hire. And I had the knowledge that they were looking for to work with Al Muir and really build up that magazine. So we went back and forth for almost 5 hours that day, from noon till 5 p.m. I'd call my mom at work. I'd call my dad at work. Hey, what do you think? I got another 2,000. I got another 1,000, whatever it was. And we eventually settled, on a number. And the company was very generous in helping me move out there and setting up an apartment. So they flew me out in November with my.
I remember this because I remember discussions with Dan and the guys. And again, your criminology or whatever was very intriguing to me, that we were going to get someone of your diverse talents who also loved the hobby. And basically, when you're telling your collector origin story, you were using the word collector, but you were always a very enterprising collector / dealer. And this guy, you always had a really great business sense. And we were intrigued by that. We did have a salary scale, so we couldn't pay you way more than somebody else, but
right, absolutely,
we had probably a range in there. So I'm so glad we went the extra mile or whatever. However, this is all happening in and around the time of my heart attack.
Shortly afterwards, absolutely.
So shortly afterwards, when you came after I'd had my heart attack, but I think the negotiations were before.
Quite possibly. Yeah. That time frame seems so long ago, but yeah, it was definitely a different time for me. And there was definitely some change in the air at Beckett, or some just a different mentality internally as to how things were moving forward. The hobby was moving at one pace. You had your own personal pace, that you had to move at. And we brought on a lot of new people around that same time, and we lost some old people. Jeff Allison moved on, and Mike Hirsch moved on, and some other guys just moved out. And I
moved out.
You moved out?
I had a heart attack, and I really never came back into the day-to-day pricing. And so that's why it was so important to get really sharp guys who, let's say you were that guy, but let's move to the after that of your career, because of all the people we hired, you were one of the most, how would I say, proactive about managing your career and being within the company and seeing opportunities, not necessarily to move up, although you did move up, but there'd be something that would come up and you would say, I could do that.
Absolutely.
Let me do that. And so where did you get that? Because that really was a benefit to our company as we moved into the late 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, I took a lot of that from my dad, who, while he was a Chicago police officer, he moved up several ranks. He had several master's degrees. He always worked multiple jobs. So I saw the work, ethic. When I started at Beckett, my goal was to really advance into an executive kind of position. I always wanted to have a say in what we were going to do, other than just pricing was awesome. And I lived that for years, but I saw that there was bigger, and I wanted to modernize what had been built. So a lot of my advancement was around the, people just say computers, well, that's bogus, development. And I built macros in Excel to help make it more efficient to gather information. And we got rid of the old satellite dish for Sportsnet downloads and really built out the framework of technology for Beckett, which allowed us to price more and more cards better and faster. Grant and Dan had their great methodologies and way of doing things, but it needed that push. So I was able to get that push and sat in your office and told you, I want to build PGS 2000 or whatever it is, the next version of price guide software.
But I always thought you were the intermediary between Grant and Dan and the price guide leadership team, and me somewhat as well, and Mark Harwell and the
Mark,
guys that were doing the digital, the programming and the architecture. And you seem to be able to speak both languages. So many of the proposals we had over the years for people to do new software for us, where they just didn't understand the hobby. You were a trusted guy. You'd done it, and you spoke both languages. So again, hats off to you. But that was an important role, Bill, and that was more important than the pricing.
Yeah, definitely. I thought the pricing could be taught to people, but being able to be that middleman to say the price guide needs to do this because the hobby is this way, and not have just a developer build a piece of software the way a developer would want to build it. It would have been disastrous for the company had we built the price guide software the wrong way. And we were able to really advance that as I moved out of pricing at, what was it, SDP or CDP at the time. And I actually moved downstairs into the interactive group and had an office down there with Chris Borden and Mark and Ari and those guys. And they had to listen to me because they didn't know what to do next. They knew the technology part, but they didn't know how the hobby had to respond. And we were doing things with text files and very basic schemes on the website, which was great because we were still the first, but we weren't the best. And we really were able to build out technology, make the price guide software better. To this day, the price guide software is the epicenter of everything that Beckett itself does. The magazines, the books, the grading database, the pop reports, you name it, that has to come from the price guide database. And we had a good structure. We had good hobby people. And I was given a lot of freedom from you and Mark and Jeff even to build this the way that a hobbyist would do it, not the way a developer wanted to do it. And that was groundbreaking for us internally, and that allowed me to grow myself, my career. Dan was entrenched as a senior manager. Grant was what he was. Theo, Mike, everyone had their spots. So I was ready for something slightly different with my knowledge of the hobby, price guides, and technology, and that really allowed us to move quickly, I think, compared to what we've done in the past. We were able to jump on that and get a really cool piece of software internally and better data and better tools for our customers.
I don't think my heart attack was an accident. It was kind of a fluke. Things happen.
Absolutely.
But I will say this, the original software that had my fingerprints all over it would only take us so far. And the challenge that you have as an entrepreneur is you either got to innovate or somebody's going to come and somebody's going to do it for you. And so to have an internal restart of somebody that really knew what they were doing, because my ideas, when I kept it simple and it worked, and now I look back, Bill, and I just think it lasted a lot longer than I would have thought. But by 96, 97, 98, 99, we wouldn't have been able to do grading if we hadn't had all this. We got into the digital age, and you were a huge part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember having a discussion in your office saying, we need a data warehouse. We already have a warehouse, somebody said. I said, no, not a physical warehouse. This is virtual. This is a place to store all the data that we've built and gathered, and it gives us the ability to copyright and lock it down in standardized formats. And that really made a difference for us getting that data warehouse.
My big issue was the protection of our intellectual property. And Mark could speak eloquently to that, but he didn't. He was more of a coin collector. So he understood collecting mentality, but the number of SKUs and the conditions and all these things that we would have. And I was very comforted in these discussions that you were involved in, because we're going to stop now because I have a 15-minute rule, but I want to get you back and talk about the other half of your experience. But you, throughout your career, from 10 years old, you're thinking, I'm a collector, but why shouldn't this be self-sustaining? Why shouldn't I enjoy it and make money and find my niche in what Bill Sutherland, can do? And you brought that mindset mentality to Beckett Publications, then Beckett Media. And I'm really glad you did. I'm glad you're not a cop.
Reasons. No. I made the right choice, and you were a great, inspiration and role model in terms of the hobby and how to build something. And it was just unbelievable for me to be able to say, I'm going to Beckett. And people said, what? No, you're not. Yeah, I was going to something that was changing the hobby, really had an impact on collectors, dealers, and even just basic hobbyists. They all knew it. And it was the coolest thing to date that I've done, was to be able to tell people, I'm going to Beckett. And that was just an awesome feeling. So thank you.
That's a good note to end on. I'm for sure going to get Bill back after a while to talk about his corporate experience with the new entities that have owned it since me. So again, thanks, Bill. Thanks, listeners. We'll be back again tomorrow with another episode.